Welcome to our deep dive into the Cultural Renaissance.
It's exciting to be here.
Today we're going to explore this amazing explosion of art and music
And innovation.
that totally transformed Europe.
Yeah.
Get ready to travel back in time with us to uncover how this era shaped our world today.
That's right.
We've got some fascinating research and articles,
I'm ready to dig in.
so let's get started.
Okay.
Now, one thing that's often forgotten
Yeah.
is that the Renaissance,
Uh-huh.
well, we typically think of it as happening from the 14th to the 17th centuries.
Right.
It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, it didn't.
So is there more to the story than just those few centuries?
There is.
What happened before that?
Well, there were earlier periods,
Oh,
almost like mini renaissances.
Oh, interesting.
Like the Carolingian and Ottonian renaissances.
Okay.
They happened way back in the 8th,
Wow.
9th, and 10th centuries.
Okay.
They may not be as famous,
Right.
but they really helped set the stage.
So it was a gradual build-up then, not just a sudden burst of creativity.
Think of it like a garden.
Okay.
Before you get these beautiful flowers,
Yeah.
you need to prepare the soil,
Right.
plant those seeds.
I see.
These early periods, along with the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts,
Oh,
they
wow.
were like that groundwork.
So those classical texts,
Yes.
like the writings of Plato
Mhm.
and the sculptures of ancient Rome,
Exactly.
they must have had a huge impact on the thinkers of the Renaissance.
They absolutely did.
Okay.
Those texts were like a window into a lost world of knowledge
Ah.
and beauty.
I see.
They inspired Renaissance thinkers to look beyond the limitations of medieval thought
Right.
and to rediscover the potential of human reason and creativity.
It's amazing how those ideas from so long ago
Yeah.
can reemerge and spark such a transformation.
It really is.
And speaking of transformations,
Yes.
let's talk about Florence.
Okay.
You've probably heard it called the cradle of the Renaissance.
It's a common term.
But what made it so special?
It must have been more than just its location in Italy.
Right.
Absolutely.
Were there specific factors that made Florence this hotbed of creativity?
Well, Florence had this unique blend of political and social structures
Uh-huh.
that encouraged artistic and intellectual growth.
Okay.
It had a somewhat democratic government for its time,
Interesting.
which allowed more people to participate in civic life.
I see.
And then there was the Medici family.
Ah, yes, the Medicis.
Very influential.
Weren't they incredibly rich and powerful?
They were like the rock stars of their time.
Wow.
Incredibly wealthy bankers who became major patrons of the arts.
So their support really helped these artists flourish.
Artists like Donatello and Botticelli.
It's like they were the venture capitalists of the Renaissance,
That's a good analogy.
investing in the most talented artists and thinkers.
Yeah.
And speaking of competition,
Uh-huh.
I read that even the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistry caused a major rivalry.
Oh, that's a great example.
Back in 1401,
Right.
two talented artists, Brunelleschi and Ghiberti,
Yes.
they competed to design those doors.
That's right.
And this rivalry pushed them to create just incredible works of art.
Incredible.
And many see this competition as the symbolic start of the Renaissance.
It's a good place to mark the beginning.
Just imagine that pressure, that
And
competition,
it's tense.
to create a masterpiece that would be seen by generations to come.
You had to be at your best.
And speaking of intense,
Oh, yeah.
we can't talk about the Renaissance without mentioning the Black Death.
That's true.
It might seem strange to link a devastating plague
Yeah.
to a period of flourishing,
Right.
but historians have drawn some intriguing connections between the two.
Yes.
It is a complex idea,
It is.
but there's evidence that the Black Death,
Uh-huh.
while a horrific tragedy,
Yes.
may have indirectly contributed to the Renaissance.
It's a strange idea, but it makes sense.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
How could a plague possibly lead to a cultural rebirth?
Well, think about the impact of the Black Death. Okay.
It wiped out a huge portion of Europe's population.
Right.
And this caused labor shortages,
Yeah.
which actually gave common people more power
Oh, interesting.
because they could demand better wages
Makes sense.
and working conditions.
I see.
And this started to challenge that old feudal system
Okay.
where peasants were tied to the land.
So the plague, in a way, shook up the social order
Exactly.
and created new possibilities.
That's right.
It also forced people to confront their own mortality. This may have shifted their focus from the afterlife, which was central to medieval thinking,
Right.
towards a greater emphasis on living life to the fullest
That's right.
and realizing human potential in the here and now.
Exactly.
That shift in focus toward human potential
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like humanism,
It does.
which was a key idea of the Renaissance.
A core idea.
Yeah, right?
Humanism placed humans at the center of things.
Uh-huh.
It emphasized human reason, creativity, and the pursuit of knowledge.
Which contrasted with that medieval focus on divine will and the afterlife.
So instead of just accepting things based on religious teachings, people started questioning,
Yeah.
exploring, and celebrating what humans could achieve.
Exactly.
So like a shift from asking, what does God want,
Yeah.
to asking, what can humans do?
That's a great way to put it.
A great example of this
Yeah.
is a piece called Oration on the Dignity of Man
Okay.
by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola.
Very important text.
What's so special about this oration?
Well, in it, Pico argues that humans, unlike angels or animals,
Okay.
have the freedom to shape their own destiny
Interesting.
and achieve greatness.
I see.
This was a radical idea at the time
Wow.
and helped fuel that creative energy of the Renaissance.
It's like a call to action.
It is.
Go out there and make something amazing of yourself.
That's right.
And they certainly
They
did.
did.
The art of the Renaissance
Yeah.
is probably the most visible and lasting legacy of this humanist spirit.
I agree.
It was a complete revolution in how artists saw the world.
It changed everything.
What were some of the key developments that set Renaissance art apart from what came before?
Well, two big changes were realism and perspective.
Okay.
Artists like Masaccio and Leonardo da Vinci
Da Vinci, of course.
were masters of portraying the human form and the world around them
Okay.
with incredible accuracy.
It sounds like they were almost obsessed with realism.
They were capturing every detail just right.
Wow.
And to achieve this realism, they developed techniques like linear perspective,
Okay.
which allowed them to create the illusion of depth
Right.
and three-dimensionality on a flat canvas.
Yeah.
It was like they were making paintings that looked like windows into another world.
I can imagine how mind-blowing that must have been for people at the
Oh,
time.
absolutely. To see
Yeah.
art that looks so lifelike. Yeah,
It was a true revolution in visual experience.
totally.
And to get that realism, they studied human anatomy in detail.
Oh, yeah.
They even dissected corpses.
To understand how muscles, bones, and tendons worked beneath the skin.
Oh, wow.
Think about Michelangelo's David.
Okay.
That incredible level of detail wouldn't have been possible without that intense study of anatomy.
David is a true masterpiece.
Absolutely.
But the Renaissance wasn't just confined to Italy, was it?
No, it wasn't.
What about the Northern Renaissance?
Right.
With artists like Jan van Eyck?
Van Eyck, yes.
Were they just copying the Italian style?
Well-
Or did they have their own thing going on?
The Northern Renaissance, while definitely influenced by Italy,
Yeah.
had its own unique character.
Right.
It started a bit later
Huh?
and held on to religious themes more strongly,
Yeah.
but it also explored the natural world in amazing detail.
I see.
The Van Eyck brothers, for example, were masters of oil painting.
Oil painting.
Yes.
Wasn't that a new technique at the time?
It was.
Wow.
And the Van Eycks perfected it,
Okay.
using it to create rich colors and incredible detail in their paintings. Their work, like the Ghent altarpiece, is unbelievably detailed.
Wow.
You can practically count the threads in the fabric of the clothes the figures are wearing.
That's impressive.
It is.
It's like they were inventing high-definition painting
Yes,
centuries before we had high-definition screens.
that's a good way to put it.
And speaking of revolutions,
Yeah.
what about music?
Uh-huh.
Did the Renaissance change the way people made and experienced music too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages, music was primarily for religious purposes.
Right.
But during the Renaissance, thanks to that influence of humanism,
Okay.
we see a surge in secular music.
Oh, interesting.
Music for entertainment
Okay.
and enjoyment.
Got it.
New instruments like the harpsichord
Okay.
and the violin family emerged.
Uh-huh.
And with the invention of the printing press,
Right.
sheet music became a hot commodity.
That makes sense.
So music became much more accessible to people outside of the church.
So did any particular styles of music emerge during this time? What was the Renaissance sound?
One of the most influential styles was the polyphonic music of the Franco-Flemish school.
Okay.
Composers like Josquin des Prez
Okay.
and Orlando di Lasso
Got it.
created incredibly complex and beautiful music with multiple independent melodic lines weaving together.
Wow.
Their music spread throughout Europe,
Yeah.
showing how ideas traveled and cross-pollinated during this time.
It sounds like they were creating the musical equivalent of those incredibly detailed paintings
That's a great way to put it.
with layers upon layers of sound.
Yes.
And speaking of layers,
Okay.
what about literature?
Uh-huh.
Did the Renaissance shake things up there as well?
Absolutely.
I have a feeling it did.
You're right.
It seems like everything was changing during the Renaissance.
It really was a period of transformation.
So the literary Renaissance
Yeah.
was just as transformative
Yes.
as its artistic counterpart.
It was a time when writers rediscovered classical literature
Okay.
and embraced humanist ideas, but it also saw the rise of vernacular languages.
Oh, interesting.
Writers like Dante, Petrarch,
No.
and Boccaccio in Italy,
Right.
and later Shakespeare in England,
Shakespeare, of course.
began writing in their native languages,
I see.
making literature accessible to a much wider audience.
Right.
This was a huge departure from that medieval practice of writing primarily in Latin,
Okay.
which was the language of scholars and the church.
That must have been a huge shift.
It was.
Writing in everyday language
Yeah.
rather than Latin.
Uh-huh.
Probably made literature much more accessible to ordinary people.
It did.
Did this have a big impact on the spread of ideas?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to read a book or a play
Uh-huh.
in a language you understand perfectly,
Right.
a language that you use every day.
It makes sense.
It allows you to connect with the text on a much deeper level
Yeah.
and engage with ideas in a way that wasn't possible before.
That's a great point.
The rise of vernacular literature really helped break down those barriers between the elite
Okay.
and the common people.
I see.
And this contributed to the spread of literacy and the exchange of ideas across social classes.
It's amazing how seemingly small changes,
Yeah.
like switching languages, can
Yeah.
have such huge ripple effects on society.
It's true.
But the Renaissance wasn't just about art.
No.
Music and literature, was it?
It wasn't.
There were major economic changes happening too.
Oh, absolutely.
The Renaissance saw a gradual shift away
Yeah.
from the feudal system
Right.
that had dominated medieval Europe.
It was a slow process,
Okay.
but those seeds of capitalism were
Yeah.
being sown.
So what were the driving forces behind this economic transformation?
Wow.
What led to this shift from feudalism to capitalism?
A few things came together.
Okay.
First, there was a rise in trade, exploration, and the discovery of new trade routes brought new wealth and opportunity to European cities.
That makes sense.
This led to the growth of a merchant class,
Okay.
people who made their money through trade rather than land ownership,
I see.
which was the basis of feudalism.
So instead of being tied to the land like peasants were under feudalism,
Right.
people had more freedom to move to cities,
Yeah.
trade,
Uh-huh.
and make their own fortunes.
Exactly.
And as cities grew,
Yeah.
so did this new merchant class.
They
They
did.
gained economic power
Huh.
and started to challenge the traditional power of the nobility and the church.
It was a shift in power from land ownership to money and trade,
Right.
the hallmarks of a market-driven economy.
And how did this economic transformation affect the arts and culture of the Renaissance?
Well, the rise of a wealthy merchant class
Yeah.
created a whole new group of potential patrons for the arts.
Oh, interesting.
Unlike the church,
Uh-huh.
which mostly commissioned religious art,
Right.
these new patrons were interested in all sorts of subjects.
Okay.
Portraits of themselves and their families' landscapes, scenes from mythology,
Ah.
you name it.
So it was like a diversification of the art market,
Exactly.
with new buyers driving new artistic trends.
That's a great way to put it.
And this diversification allowed artists to explore their creativity more freely.
It did.
And it contributed to that amazing variety and innovation we see in Renaissance art.
Absolutely.
But these changes must have caused some tension, right?
They did.
I mean, the Catholic Church,
Uh-huh.
which had held so much power for centuries,
Yes.
must have felt threatened by these new ways of thinking,
Right.
this shift in power.
The Renaissance emphasis on individual interpretation
Yeah,
and critical thinking was
Oh.
a direct challenge to the church's authority.
right.
Remember, in the Middle Ages, the church was the primary source of knowledge and guidance.
Okay.
But now,
Yeah.
with the rediscovery of classical texts
Uh-huh.
and the rise of humanism,
Yeah.
people started to question long-held doctrines and beliefs.
And that questioning eventually led to the Reformation, right?
It did.
A movement that shook the foundations of the Catholic Church
Yeah.
and changed the religious landscape of Europe forever.
It was a major turning point.
So figures like Martin Luther,
Yes.
fueled by Renaissance ideas about individual conscience, and scriptural interpretation
Exactly.
began to openly challenge the church's practices
Yes.
and doctrines.
And guess what? Played a key role in spreading these reformist ideas.
The printing press,
You got it.
of course.
The printing press allowed Luther's ideas, like his famous 95 Theses,
Right.
to spread like wildfire throughout Europe.
I see.
It was impossible for the church to contain that dissent.
It's amazing how the threads of the Renaissance,
Yeah.
from humanism to the printing press, ultimately contributed to such a huge shift in religious authority.
It really did.
And this wasn't just a European phenomenon, was it?
No, it wasn't.
The Renaissance spirit, along with European exploration,
Yeah.
had ripple effects across the globe. This is the age of exploration,
Yes.
with Europeans sailing across oceans
Right.
and mapping new continents.
Uh-huh.
And the Renaissance spirit,
Yeah.
with its emphasis on exploration and discovery,
That's right.
played a big role in that.
Think about explorers like Christopher Columbus,
Okay.
Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan.
Right.
They were all driven by a desire to expand the boundaries of human knowledge and experience.
That must have been incredible
Oh,
to
absolutely.
be alive at that time,
Yeah.
to see the world expanding before your very eyes.
But of course, this expansion wasn't without its dark side.
That's true.
European exploration often led to the exploitation and conquest of indigenous peoples.
Right.
And the tragic consequences of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely a simple story.
You're right.
It's often a mix of positive and negative
Uh-huh.
with unintended consequences.
Yes.
The Renaissance,
Yeah.
for all its achievement,
No.
also laid the groundwork for European colonialism
Yeah.
and the transatlantic slave trade.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
It reminds us that we can't just celebrate the achievement of the Renaissance
Right.
without acknowledging the complexities and contradictions of this era.
You are absolutely right.
It's important to look at history with open eyes
Yes,
and recognize both the positive and negative aspects of its legacy.
I agree.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part
We have
of our deep dive into the cultural Renaissance.
a great start.
We've seen how it emerged from the Middle Ages,
Right.
how it was shaped by earlier periods,
Yeah.
and by unexpected events like the Black Death,
That's right.
and how it led to transformative changes in art, music, literature, and even the very structure of European society.
It's been a fascinating exploration so far.
It has.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve even deeper into the specific achievements and challenges of this remarkable era, from the rise of modern science
Interesting.
to the impact of the Renaissance on the world beyond Europe.
I can't wait to continue this journey with you.
I'm looking forward to it.
Join us next time as we continue our exploration of the cultural Renaissance.
I hope you'll join us. Welcome back to our deep dive into the cultural Renaissance.
It's great to be back.
As we explored in the last part,
Right.
this period was so much more than just beautiful art and music.
Absolutely.
It was a time of huge changes in how people thought about the world
Yeah.
and their place in it.
It really challenges those simple history book narratives
Yeah.
that make everything seem neat and tidy.
He wasn't neat and tidy.
We've seen how the Renaissance had these deep roots in earlier periods,
Right.
and how seemingly unrelated events,
Yeah.
like the Black Death,
Uh-huh.
had a ripple effect on everything that followed.
History is anything but a straight line.
That's for sure.
And the Renaissance, with its emphasis on challenging the status quo,
Yeah.
really embodies the spirit of intellectual exploration.
And speaking of challenges,
Okay.
in the last part, we discussed the rise of humanism
We did.
and how it shifted the focus from divine will to human potential.
That's right.
Right. And that shift had some major consequences for the Catholic Church,
It did.
which was used to being the ultimate authority.
Of course.
We touched on the Reformation,
We did.
but I'd love to understand more about how the printing press helped spread those reformist ideas so quickly.
Well, imagine a world where knowledge is controlled by a select few.
Okay.
Books are copied by hand, one at a time,
Yeah.
and are incredibly expensive.
Right.
Only the wealthy and powerful have access to them.
I see.
That was the reality before Gutenberg invented the printing press in the mid-15th century.
So Gutenberg's invention was a game changer,
Absolutely.
like the internet of its time.
A good analogy.
Yeah.
It allowed for the mass production of books,
Right.
making knowledge more accessible
Yeah.
and affordable
Okay.
to a much wider audience.
So instead of relying on the church to tell them what the Bible said,
Uh-huh.
people could now read and interpret it for themselves.
That's right.
That must have been incredibly empowering.
It was a huge shift.
Think about Martin Luther's 95 Theses,
Okay.
a document that criticized some of the church's practices.
Yes.
Thanks to the printing press,
Right.
his ideas spread rapidly throughout Europe,
They did.
igniting a debate that would transform Christianity.
It's impossible to overstate the impact of this new technology.
Wow.
It gave people the ability to access information and challenge traditional sources of authority.
Right.
Not just in religion, but in all aspects of life.
It's fascinating how technology can have such a profound impact
It is.
on the way ideas spread
Yeah.
and how societies change.
It's like Gutenberg set off an information explosion that couldn't be contained.
That's a great analogy.
And that explosion of information had a huge impact on the development of science, philosophy, and political thought.
Speaking of science, was there a specific Renaissance science? Or were they just rediscovering what the ancient Greeks and Romans already knew?
It was a combination of both.
Okay.
Renaissance thinkers certainly rediscovered ancient scientific knowledge,
Yeah.
but they didn't stop there.
They didn't.
They embraced observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning to understand the natural world.
So they were building on the knowledge of the past,
Right.
but also developing new ways of thinking and exploring.
Exactly.
And that led to some incredible breakthroughs.
Like
Well, think about Leonardo da Vinci,
Vinci,
Nicholas Copernicus,
Copernicus,
and Galileo.
Galileo.
They challenged long-held assumptions
Yes.
and paved the way for the scientific revolution that would follow.
Major figures.
Da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man,
Of course.
the studying anatomy, engineering,
Uh-huh.
and who knows what else.
So many things.
Then Copernicus proposed this radical idea
Yeah.
that the Earth revolves around the sun,
The radical idea.
challenging that belief that the Earth was the center of the universe.
It really shook things up.
And Galileo,
Yes.
using his telescope,
Right.
confirmed Copernicus's theory through observation.
Exactly.
It's like a chain reaction of scientific discoveries.
It's an exciting time.
And these discoveries weren't happening in isolation.
Right.
The Renaissance fostered a spirit of collaboration and the exchange of ideas among scientists, artists, and thinkers.
It wasn't just about individual brilliance,
No.
but also about a supportive environment
Okay,
where those brilliant minds could connect
right.
and inspire each other.
And patronage played a huge role in that.
It did.
Wealthy individuals and institutions,
Yeah.
like the Medici family in Florence.
The Medicis again.
They supported scholars and scientists,
Right.
providing them with the resources and freedom to pursue their research.
It's like they were investing in the future of knowledge.
It sounds like the Medicis were more than just art lovers. They were fostering an entire ecosystem
Yeah.
of intellectual and scientific advancement.
They had a vision.
And it wasn't just confined to laboratories
No.
and observatories.
The Renaissance also saw an explosion of exploration in the physical world,
Right.
with explorers venturing across oceans
Yeah.
and mapping new continents.
That's true.
This was the age of exploration,
It was.
driven by a thirst for knowledge, wealth, and new trade routes.
It was a time of incredible daring
Yeah.
and discovery,
Uh-huh.
but also a time of conquest and exploitation.
Unfortunately, yes.
You're getting at a very important point.
Go on.
While the Renaissance fueled these advancements in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography
Yeah.
that made these voyages possible,
They did.
European exploration often came at a terrible cost
Did.
to the people and cultures they encountered.
It's a dark side of the story.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely a simple story.
It rarely is.
It's often a mix of positive and negative, with unintended consequences.
Yeah.
The Renaissance, for all its achievements, also laid the groundwork for European colonialism
Right.
and the transatlantic slave trade.
You're absolutely right.
While it's tempting to romanticize the Renaissance,
It is.
it's crucial to acknowledge the full complexity of its legacy.
Yes.
It was a period of tremendous innovation and creativity, but also a time of conquest, exploitation,
Right.
and the displacement of indigenous people.
It's a reminder that even the most celebrated historical periods
Yeah,
have their dark side.
that's a powerful reminder.
It is.
We can't look at history through rose-colored glasses.
No, we can't.
We need to understand the whole story.
Yeah.
The good and the bad.
Absolutely.
And you make an excellent point.
History is full of nuance.
Yes.
And it's up to us to grapple with that complexity.
As we move into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I think it would be fascinating to discuss
Yeah.
how the Renaissance transitioned into the modern era.
A good question.
How did those seeds planted during this period
Uh-huh.
ultimately lead to the world we live in today?
That's what we'll explore next.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the cultural Renaissance. We've covered so much ground already, from its origins in the late Middle Ages to that incredible explosion of art, music, and ideas. And we've seen how the printing press just revolutionized the spread of knowledge. And humanism really challenged that authority of the church. And of course, we talked about how the spirit of exploration led to those incredible discoveries, but also those tragic consequences.
Yeah, it has been quite a journey, hasn't it? And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm really eager to discuss how the Renaissance ultimately transitioned into the modern era. How did those seeds that were planted during this time shape the world we live in today?
That's a great question. It seems like the Renaissance wasn't just this contained event. It's like its ideas continue to ripple outwards and evolve over time. Where do we even begin to trace that influence?
Well, one key factor was that continued growth and spread of knowledge. We talked about the printing press, but this wasn't just a one-time revolution. The production and circulation of books just kept increasing, and new centers of learning emerged.
So it was like the printing press created this initial spark,
Yeah.
and then the fire just kept spreading, leading to more books, more readers, and more ideas.
Exactly. Universities expanded their curricula, incorporating humanist ideas and the latest scientific discoveries. Scholarly societies and academies were founded, creating spaces for intellectuals to collaborate and debate.
So we're seeing a shift from knowledge being controlled by a select few to a much more open and accessible system of learning. That must have had a huge impact on the development of modern science and scholarship.
Oh, it absolutely did. That Renaissance ideal of the Renaissance man, someone who was an expert in many fields, gradually gave way to more specialized fields of study.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between a general practitioner and a specialist in medicine. You need both, but sometimes you need someone who has really focused their entire career on understanding a specific area in depth.
You're exactly right. And while specialization sometimes gets criticized for creating those silos of knowledge, it also allowed for much deeper exploration and advancement in specific areas, which ultimately contributed to that explosion of scientific and technological progress we see in the modern era.
It's interesting to think about how that Renaissance ideal of being this well-rounded individual eventually led to this specialization that's so characteristic of modern science and academia. What of the arts? Did that Renaissance style continue to dominate, or did new trends emerge as we move into the modern era?
Well, the Renaissance aesthetic, with its focus on realism perspective and classical forms, remained influential for centuries. But as we move into the late 16th and 17th centuries, we see the emergence of new artistic movements, like Mannerism and the Baroque.
Those names sound familiar, but I admit I don't know much about them. How did those styles differ from that classic Renaissance style?
Well, Mannerism, which emerged in Italy, really played with those conventions of Renaissance art, using distorted proportions and exaggerated poses to create a sense of drama and emotional intensity. Think of those elongated figures and swirling compositions of artists like Pontormo and Parmigianino. They were really pushing the boundaries of what was considered beautiful and harmonious.
It sounds like they were rebelling against that order and balance of the High Renaissance, injecting a bit more emotion and drama into their art.
That's a great way to put it. And then came the Baroque, which was all about grandeur, theatricality, and movement. It appealed to the senses and emotions and was often used to glorify the church and the ruling elite. Think of the dramatic lighting, rich colors, and dynamic compositions in the paintings of Caravaggio, Rubens, and Bernini.
It sounds almost operatic, like the art itself is putting on a performance.
You're right. There is a sense of spectacle and drama in Baroque art that's quite different from the serene beauty of the High Renaissance. And those shifts in style weren't happening in a vacuum. The late Renaissance and the Baroque period were times of great upheaval, with religious and political conflicts shaking Europe to its core.
Of course, we talked about the Reformation, but it seems like the aftershocks of that event continue to be felt for centuries.
Oh, they did. The Reformation shattered the unity of the Catholic Church, leading to wars and conflicts across Europe, and the rise of absolute monarchies with their centralized power and opulent courts also played a major role in shaping the cultural landscape of this period.
So while artistic styles were evolving, that political and religious landscape was also undergoing a dramatic transformation. It makes you wonder how much those external forces influenced the art and ideas of the time.
Well, it's impossible to separate art and ideas from the historical context in which they're created. They reflect and respond to the anxieties, the aspirations, and the power dynamics of their time. But amidst all this turmoil, were there any positive developments emerging from that Renaissance legacy?
That's a good question. It sounds like things were getting pretty chaotic in Europe. Was there any progress amidst all the upheaval?
There was. One of the most significant developments was in the realm of political and social thought. That Renaissance emphasis on human reason and individual potential laid the groundwork for new ideas about how society should be governed.
So those humanist ideas that started back in those Italian city-states were starting to have a real impact on how people thought about power and governance.
Exactly. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who were deeply influenced by Renaissance humanism, developed theories about natural rights, individual liberty, and the social contract. That idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. These ideas would later inspire revolutions in America and France, shaping the course of modern democracy.
Wow. So those conversations about human potential and individual freedom that started in the Renaissance eventually led to some of those foundational principles of modern democracy. That's an incredible legacy.
It really is. And it's a reminder that progress isn't always a linear process. It can take centuries for ideas to take root and blossom into full-fledged social and political movements.
It's also a reminder that the Renaissance wasn't just about those pretty paintings and fancy sculptures. It was about challenging the status quo, exploring new ideas, and ultimately laying the groundwork for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. As we conclude this deep dive into the cultural Renaissance, I hope we've all gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and significance of this era. It was a period of incredible artistic achievements, scientific breakthroughs, and profound shifts in how humans viewed themselves and their place in the universe. But it was also a time of great upheaval and contradiction, with its legacy intertwined with both progress and the shadows of colonialism and exploitation.
It has been a truly eye-opening journey, and I think you left us with a really important takeaway. We need to approach history with a critical eye, acknowledging both its triumphs and its tragedies.
I couldn't agree more. It's by understanding the past in all its complexity that we can better navigate the present and work towards a future that honors the best aspects of that Renaissance legacy, its spirit of curiosity, its passion for knowledge, and its enduring belief in human potential.
Thank you for taking us on this incredible deep dive. It's been an incredibly rewarding experience. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring the Renaissance and its many facets. There's always more to discover, and who knows, you might even find some inspiration for your own creative endeavors. Until next time, keep diving deep.